This video was sponsored by CuriosityStream in partnership with my streaming service Nebula. On the 18th of June 2020, Mozilla announced a VPN service, aptly called Mozilla VPN. The announcement was understandably met with a collective shrug by the tech press. The internet was already drowning in VPN services, so why would anyone really care? And yet, while I think it might not have raised many eyebrows at first, this $4.99 a month subscription service was not some minor news. It was the clearest, most tangible sign yet of a troubled company desperately trying to reinvent itself. So in the 70th episode of the Story Behind series, let's see where the new Mozilla is headed and why they are so troubled in the first place. Mozilla got started in 1998 by members of Netscape in a time when the future of the internet looked rather bleak. Microsoft was on a warpath to monopolize the internet with proprietary technologies that could only be opened in its own Internet Explorer, and Mozilla emerged as a clear opponent to it, aiming to break that dominance and ensure that the web would remain open and free. Early on, Mozilla set its principles in writing, known as the Mozilla Manifesto, firmly committing themselves to values like privacy, interoperability, free and open source software, and a balance between commercial profit and public benefit. And in the following years, the company got to work building the tools needed for an open internet. A web browser, an email client, an online knowledge base for web development, bug trackers, they built them all together with an army of volunteers, and they made them all free, open source, and placed them firmly under the watchful eyes of a non-profit parent. And Mozilla arguably succeeded. The Microsoft takeover failed and the open web for the most part prevailed. But with the evil dragon now slain, new, more nimble companies set their hungry eyes on the internet, and Mozilla, with their rigid model, wasn't able to fight them back. See, one thing the Mozilla Manifesto never really gave an answer to was how exactly a balance between commercial profit and public benefit could be achieved on the long term. Like, who's supposed to pay for all the software and services that Mozilla builds? It's hard to make any money from open source software to begin with, and especially hard when you write a manifesto that you'll give it away for free and won't even track your users or show them advertising, and even more so when your competitors do not have to hold themselves to such high standards. Despite having developed everything from the Firefox web browser and the Thunderbird email client to an entire mobile operating system, identity management software, a location service, a password manager, a tool for monitoring hacked passwords, an ultra-popular programming language, and many of the foundations of the internet as we know it, Mozilla has only ever really managed to make money in one meaningful way: by letting companies like Google and Yahoo pay for being the default search engine in the Firefox browser. Every year since their first proper revenues in 2005, this single item has consistently made 80 to sometimes even 99% of all revenues of all of Mozilla, meaning that everything else they did was losing them money. Mozilla has really cornered themselves into this insanely skewed business model with their original, very noble commitments. I'm sure that back then, selling the rights to become the default search engine provider in their web browser to some scrappy startup seemed like the least evil way to make a lot of money from their users. But over time, this relationship has really become toxic. As Google launched Chrome and moved from being a scrappy startup to becoming a larger and larger privacy nightmare and also an anti-competitive monopolist, which I've made a dedicated video about that you can watch here, Mozilla found itself in bed with their own worst competitor whose values go against everything Mozilla stands for. And there is no easy alternative for Mozilla. They tried switching to another search provider in 2012 when they signed a 5-year contract to use Yahoo instead of Google in the US. But before that contract even ran out, they had to concede defeat and switch back to Google, in large part because, as it turns out, the average consumer doesn't know how to switch default search engines and prefers Google search so much that they're actually willing to change browsers for it. And Google knows fully well that Mozilla can't switch, which is why they only pay them around $400 to $500 million a year. Compare that to the $12 billion Google paid to Apple for premium placement in Safari in 2019, and the lack of bargaining power becomes abundantly clear. Apple can just afford to negotiate, while Mozilla can't. In fact, I'm fairly sure Google's main reason for paying Mozilla at all is just to have a competitor to point their fingers at in court when they're questioned about antitrust. So given all of that, given that Firefox is unlikely to gain massive market share all of a sudden, or find new wealthy sponsors to replace Google with all of a sudden, or given that people are unlikely to donate huge amounts of money all of a sudden, I mean, donations only make up a couple of % of the actual revenues of Mozilla. Given all of that, something needs to change. Otherwise, Mozilla will just slowly fade into irrelevance. And after many years of struggle, I think Mozilla has finally found two key ways to generate revenue. First, what I'll call paid services, and second, what I'd call enterprise software. The service business is relatively straightforward, and the Mozilla VPN shows us the ideal playbook. As almost any YouTuber with a sponsorship will tell you, VPNs basically route all of your internet traffic through the VPN company's servers, who then promises to encrypt everything, promises to not spy on you, promises to not keep any logs on you, etc. What sponsored YouTubers aren't supposed to tell you, of course, is that you, the average consumer, really have no way of verifying whether they actually keep any of their promises. So if you choose a VPN service, it better be from a company that, as Mozilla says, has a name you can trust. And yeah, you know what? If I were to route all of my sensitive internet traffic through some company's web servers, Mozilla, and whoever they partner with, would probably be a better choice than yet another VC-backed startup with little to no track record. Add to that VPNs are also wildly profitable, hence why they can afford to sponsor seemingly all of YouTube, and yeah, that looks like a promising business. And there's more where that came from. In a blog post from last year, Mozilla has confirmed that they are, quote, starting to invest in services that stand apart from the browser and bring Mozilla's core philosophical commitments to privacy, security, and user control to new audiences. And what are those services? Well, so far, we've seen three major attempts: Firefox Send, Monitor, and Lockwise, a file transfer service, a service that monitors if your accounts got hacked, and a password manager. And while these have all been, well, moderately successful, with Send being shut down and the other two not having made any money yet, they have all the same core characteristics as a VPN. They are online services that don't have to be directly tied to your browser. They compete with paid services like WeTransfer and LastPass, so in theory, they could be monetized, and trust is crucially important for all three of them. You really wouldn't want to store your passwords or send your most sensitive files using just any company, but Mozilla? Probably not a bad choice. And it's easy to see where they could go from here. Lockwise could get a paid tier with premium features like all other commercial password managers, and Mozilla could start offering new services as well, like a Google Drive or Dropbox competitor with end-to-end encryption, an email service to take on Proton Mail, or frankly any other internet service where security and trust are important. I think even their new logo designs were made with flexibility in mind, so they can just add more services as they go. Now, besides services, the second revenue source Mozilla has found for itself is enterprise software. In other words, charging companies that use various Mozilla software for fancy extended support. And I'm going out on a bit of a limb here, but I think I found two pretty strong signs for this. First, Thunderbird, their email client, has for the longest time just hung around kind of aimlessly, and they almost got rid of it at some point. But then, all of a sudden, earlier this year, Mozilla founded a new for-profit company called MZLA Technologies Corporation, whose stated purpose was to own and operate Thunderbird. And guess what? In their announcement post, they said their goal was to, quote, explore offering products and services that were not previously possible, and to collect revenue through partnerships and non-charitable donations. If I'm any good at actually parsing corporate speech, I think that means they're gonna make a paid version of Thunderbird, which, why not? And the other example I found is actually one that I talked about in my old video from 6 months ago with regards to KaOS. If you haven't seen it yet, you can check it out here, but KaOS is a wildly successful commercial operating system built on top of the open source remains of Firefox OS, and this year Mozilla has entered into an agreement to officially start supporting it, and promised to ensure that the so-called ESR or extended support release versions of its browsers would be compatible with KaOS. And while neither party would explicitly confirm or deny when I asked if money was actually changing hands for the support, I think it's pretty safe to assume that, yeah, KaOS is probably paying for the support. Why wouldn't they? And I really like this new direction. I love the Mozilla of the past for making free software that's available to everyone without crappy tracking. I donate to them every year, and I hope they don't stop doing that. But even more than that, I'd love it if the Mozilla of the future could stop relying on handouts from Google and could instead build a portfolio of services themselves that respected the open web, my privacy, and were actually worth paying for. I really believe that a healthy internet shouldn't just be controlled by a handful of monopolists like Google who can track every move you make and decide what content and ads you're supposed to watch, which is part of why I've teamed up with some of the world's best educational creators to build our very own video streaming platform called Nebula. Nebula is a beautiful premium video streaming platform built and owned by creators like me, Polymatter, Real Engineering, Low Spec Gamer, Wendover Productions, and more. It's free of ads, it doesn't invade your privacy, and it lets us creators focus on just making really good content for you rather than worrying about demonetization, upsetting the magical YouTube algorithm, and whatnot. My videos from both of my channels are up on Nebula, completely ad-free of course, and TechAltar ones even release a day early there. Nebula has lots of great originals, including a brand new podcast section, but also lots of fantastic video originals from the likes of Mustard, who explores Soviet engineers trying to turn fighting jets into business jets, or the fascinating story of oversized Imperial Japanese aircraft carriers, for example. Access to Nebula comes for free with a subscription to my sponsor, CuriosityStream, which itself is 26% off right now. So you get both services for just over $1 a month. CuriosityStream is of course the premier place on the internet for high-quality professional documentaries from the founder of the Discovery Channel, and they have a huge library of science, nature, and history content to binge while you are stuck at home. I'm currently watching Cyber War in my free time, which is a documentary on hackers and governments doing nasty things, because apparently that's just the whole world we're living in from now on. And there's lots of other great content from hosts like David Attenborough, Jane Goodall, Stephen Hawking, and more. So check them out at the link in the description, and I'll see you next week.